Nickel, the battleground for EV supremacy. If you tuned in yesterday, you'll know this is a hot topic in the world. I shared some of my views on it. We had Anthony Molesky, who's a much bigger expert than I am, sharing his views on it. So let's keep this conversation going. We have another fantastic expert, Ken Hoffman, who's senior expert for McKinsey's Basic Materials Institute. But I will let Frik Els introduce him. Let me introduce Frik, who is our head of content and our editor for mining.com. He has over 20 years experience as a business journalist across a range of industries, including investment, automotive, technology, and travel, and leisure markets. He has an entry in Global Mining Observer's Who's Who of Mining, of course he does, and contributions to publications and conferences, including Business Insider, Investing.com, Mines and Money in London and New York, Vancouver Resource Investment, Progressive Mine Forum in Toronto, and Canadian Mining Symposium in London, UK, where he joined us. He's been interviewed on CBC Radio and Korea State TV even. And in 2020, he created the mining.com EV Metal Index, which tracks the value of battery metals and newly sold electric cars around the world. And for those of you that are daily readers of mining.com, as I am, and you should be, if you're not, you'll know that Frik produces some of the leading content on the subject of electric vehicles and battery metals. Frik, welcome to the Global Mining Symposium. Welcome back, I should say.
Thank you.
Key moderator through all of these. It's great to see you. You're joining us from Vancouver. How are you doing today?
I'm very good. I just want to make it sure everybody knows it's 8 o'clock in the morning here. So if the coffee hasn't kicked in yet, forgive me.
We'll cut you a little bit of slack, but I got a feeling you're going to be pretty sharp. And if you're not, Ken's going to make you sharper. You're going to have to stay sharp to keep up with Ken. I can tell you that.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Let me pass it over to the two of you gentlemen. Frik, I'll let you do the introductions of Ken, and we'll sit back and watch.
Yes. Good morning, Ken.
Good morning.
Yes. I had a look back yesterday. The first time we spoke was, can't believe it, is now 6 years ago when you were with Bloomberg Intelligence. And we spoke about copper. So your knowledge of the industry is obviously very wide and deep. But today I want to just get into nickel because it's called the devil's copper. There's all sorts of things going on in the nickel industry that's not always easy to parse. So yeah, you are in charge of electric vehicles research at McKinsey. I imagine that part of the business is only growing and will grow. So yeah, let's jump right into it. I guess we cannot start any discussion about nickel without mentioning Tsingshan and what they've done for the industry. Not just in March with their announcement on nickel sulfate and matte, but since they started with NPI and kind of upended the market to an extent. I see, nickel fell almost 20% on that news, but it's made back half of that by now, so it's back at 18,000. How do we read the longer term implications of their new process? Or it's not a new process, but they seem to have commercialized it.
Yeah, to step back a bit and sort of talk about the world of EVs and why Tsingshan's announcement is probably so controversial. And Jim Lennon and I spoke about this just the other day. We have different takes on the nickel market. The EV market did not exist a few years ago. Literally, if you go back a decade, I think there was like 22,000 EVs sold in the world. There was 4.3 million sold last year. If it weren't for a chip shortage, you'd probably hit 6 or 7 million units this year. And so about 200,000 metric tons of nickel went into EVs last year. It'll be 300 plus probably this year. And if you look at class 1 nickel, which is sort of gets into the heart of the matter, it's about 20 to 25% of all nickel in the world is just going to EVs right now. And so when we look at things, we sort of say there's class 1 nickel and there's class 2 nickel. The brilliance of Tsingshan was years ago recognizing, all the miners knew there was an awful lot of nickel in Indonesia. That you go back in old notes, everybody knew it was there, but it had a lot of iron with it. And the Chinese made the great discovery, hey, I'm making stainless steel out of this stuff. Why don't I just melt it down a bit, concentrate it to 6 to 12% nickel content, and take that material and sort of put it into stainless steel. And at the time, you can remember, the world was really running short nickel. The price of nickel got up to, it was nearing $50,000 a metric ton. And all of a sudden, this new evolution came out of a sort of a quick and cheap way to mass produce nickel units. That sent the price all the way down to as low as $8,000 a metric ton, and many in the industry feel very, very burnt by that. And so when Tsingshan comes out and says, "Aha, guys, we have a new process that will mass produce more nickel to the market, even no matter how much the EV battery market makes, we have a problem." Few things. One, it's not a new process that they've provided. It's actually a process that's been around from the mid 70s. And we're not quite sure, it hasn't really worked fantastically so far. And it hasn't been a very cheap process as well. So that's sort of part of the issue. And then the question is the purity there of the material. EV batteries, you'll actually get a quote for parts per billion of your detriments in that nickel quality in order for it to work in a battery. And one of the number one detriments you don't want in nickel is iron. Iron really messes up a cell chemistry. So there's an awful lot of problems out there. Now, that being said, we hope some of this works because, about every $1,000 move in nickel adds about 80 cents per kilowatt hour to the price of a vehicle. And, if you were to see, say, a $20,000 or $30,000 increase in nickel, that would be a $10 to $15, you're talking about 20 to 30% increase in the cost of just the battery. Yeah. And our single biggest fear for the nickel market is you're going to boom, prices are going to go up so high because of EVs move on to something else, and nickel sort of has done what it's always done, which is a huge boom and then a big bust. And that's sort of our biggest fear.
Right. Yeah, it's almost the chicken and egg situation. You have to have expensive nickel for people to mine it. But it gets too expensive, like you said, it's a boom. You move on. Yeah. So I had a look yesterday just on, LFP batteries, which sort of come out of nowhere. And according to the data I saw, they're up to 15% market share overall already from basically a standing start. But one of the slides you showed me of the research path or the development path of EV batteries or batteries in general, lithium-ion batteries, nickel is all over it. Nickel is sort of the golden thread that goes through all of it. What is the future of battery chemistries or cathode chemistries for that matter?
Sure. Let me show a slide here to sort of indicate what's going on out there. And hopefully you can see my screen. LFP batteries have actually been around. They're an iron-based cathode battery. They've been around for 40 years. So they are definitely not a new technology. There's one company that has really done the best job with that, and that's a company in China called CATL. But when we look at sort of energy density, and so remember, when people buy a vehicle, and we survey 15,000 people around the world every year, and it doesn't matter whether you're in Norway or you're in Toronto or you're in Japan, everyone tells us the exact same thing. It doesn't matter. They say, I have an internal combustion engine out there in the driveway. It gets me 600 to 900 kilometers range, and it recharges in 6 to 8 minutes. I'll move to an electric car when it can pretty much replicate that. And so in order to do that, energy density is one of the most important parts of a battery. How many electrons can I put into a certain amount of space? LFP batteries, if we look, and I'll try to annotate this, LFP batteries are sort of right here. They're about 170 watts per kilo And that's pretty much where they sit today. Nothing has happened in terms of making them really much more energy dense than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. If we look at the best in class high nickel batteries, they're at about double, about 300 watts per kilo. So why all of a sudden do we hear LFP? One of it is optionality. As I said, if you did, 4 million cars consume 200,000 tons of nickel on average, there's a product mix there, but what if we get to the world which needs 80 to 100 million vehicles? If I multiply that number out there, and the nickel market for class 1 nickel is 1.5 million tons, you very quickly run out of nickel. And so the car makers have sort of said, look, we need many chemistries just in case. And LFP has worked for two reasons. One, it's very inexpensive. You're probably paying about $85 to $90 if you're a huge OEM for your high nickel batteries, and you're paying like $60 to $65 for LFP. And they've been able to sort of, as they make these vehicles, they're taking out all the packaging they used to need. They used to need all this. We ripped down about 15 EVs over time. We've noticed that the transition of a lot less packaging, a lot less wiring, a lot less copper actually. But in that space you took out all the packaging, you can put in more chemicals. And so you're, instead of putting in 50 units of LFP battery and getting, 100 kilometer range, you can put in 100 and get, 200 kilometer range. And it's just enough for that low end, very inexpensive vehicle for them to get some market share. Will it take over the marketplace? Absolutely not. Because consumers in the West don't want 200, 300 kilometers. They want, 600, 800 kilometers. And
is there some sort of theoretical maximum for LFPs? I mean, they have caught up. I believe they're sort of they're kind of on par with the older high nickel content cathodes. Can it go
that's sort of this. They're getting sort of close to the first area. No, they're not going to really. Well, it depends, and that's a typical consulting answer, right? And that is, could we move to a solid state battery? So a solid state battery now. Do electrons, would they rather flow through a liquid or flow through something solid? Of course, they want to flow through something liquid. It's a lot easier. Yes. But what solid state batteries, when you hear that term, it's changing the anode. And so the anode today is roughly 40% of the weight. It's graphite. Sometimes they put a little tiny bit of silicon in there. But if you can actually take another material other than graphite, say lithium metal, and put that in, instantly what you do is you reduce the weight by 40%, so you increase your density significantly. And two, you can charge a lot faster, because you charge through the anode, and to charge through lithium's a lot quicker and faster than charging through the anode. The problem is lithium's a real bugger of a material. It degrades crazy fast. And so solid state is supposed to, if I have a solid surface against it, hopefully I can keep it from degrading and having a long enough life that it makes a useful material. There are companies out there that are taking an approach to a solid state battery using lithium metal, or even there's some Solid Energy Systems and MIT spin out of Boston that's using liquid electrolyte with a lithium metal anode, but using LFP. And so their idea is that would get, we think, 360 to 380 watts per kilo. So sort of put you, at what we think might happen in, say, 2024. It's not the 500 or 600 watts per kilo of an NMC battery, but it would be a lot better than today. And that could give you pretty decent range. And so we'll have to see the developments there.
Right. And I see, 2030 is not that far away, and we're looking at 750 kilowatt hours and real solid state or complete solid state.
Yeah, I mean, most companies are trying to get this onto the market in the next, 4 or 5 years. We've probably done work on 6 or 7 of the leading solid state batteries out there, or new technologies out there. If you hear all the hype, I mean, in reality, where all these guys sort of are is it works in the lab. Great. It works in sort of batch processing. Great. They've sent those samples along, and we call pre-A samples, to the automakers, and the automakers are sort of looking at all these different areas. Now it's like, well, how do we actually get from there to a battery that works on that's in a car, working in a car? And that's, we think it's going to take 4 to 5 years for that to work. A big thing is what goes on in China. There's a lot of rumblings out of China that they already have workable solid state batteries in their vehicles today. And remember, the move to 8 811 chemistries, that higher nickel chemistry, was really spurred by the move in China to put those into the batteries as early as 2018. So,
Right.
so China can really move the rest of the world's needle very quickly if that competitive pressure is there.
Right. So maybe we should go back a little bit further upstream. I think you, in this presentation, you predict that there could be a class 1 nickel shortage as soon, within 2 years. And I mean, the demand side is pretty much there. And if you're adding 1 million tons in demand just from the battery sector, out of a market that's what, 2.5 million today. I mean, how can prices not go up?
We worry a lot about prices, to tell you the truth. Again, right now there's a bottleneck on EV production, and that bottleneck is batteries and chips. The world is very short battery capacity and very short chip capacity, as you've heard in the press. And so there's a limit on nickel demand at the moment, just because they just can't make the cars. Demand far exceeds supply. We will see many, many more vehicles come on the market over the next few years. We believe the chip and the battery usage will, those capacity bottlenecks will be alleviated. And that is going to put an awful lot of pressure on nickel. So from that standpoint, that's why you've seen, Tesla again and again and again say, we are worried about nickel. You saw Volkswagen in their battery day say, we are worried about nickel. They are trying to set up long-term deals. Now, the interesting part, they want these deals for a few reasons. One, they want to make sure they have supply. And so you've seen companies trying to secure supply, for example, what BASF and Norilsk have done in Finland. These companies are trying to secure supply because, one, they're afraid of nickel units. Two, remember that regulators in Europe and most likely in the US are asking for your ESG footprint. So they eventually are going to tax you on your carbon, your water, your sulfur, whatever contents in that vehicle, because they don't want the EV to be a dirty car. And so I want to make sure, if I'm an OEM, that I understand what is in there, and that's another thing that sort of hurts Tsingshan, that the process they're using is very, very sulfur use. And so, could this tax yourself out of the market? And how big could the tax be? Well, currently in the European Union, the tax on internal combustion engines is 15,000 euros a vehicle on average. It's a very large tax. And so that puts a lot of value on trying to keep as strong an ESG or as good of an ESG footprint as possible. And when we break down the EV, where most of the emissions come from today, it's nickel.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah, so we know China has, has sort of cornered the cobalt supply chain. I mean, all the way from the mines in the DRC to the converters, obviously the battery makers, etc. Aren't they basically far down the road when it comes to nickel? And Indonesia, with I know that Tsingshan itself is building huge smelters there. Because of the ore export ban. Are they locking in supply from Indonesia, which seems to be the one place you can still go, or the best place to go if you're looking for lots of nickel at this point?
Yeah, I mean, you have seen massive investments of China into Indonesia, so that is true. You're seeing other companies in there, Aramets in there. There are some other companies in there, and you're starting to see sort of some of the juniors in Australia and Canada get some interest. Talk to Mark Selby over at Canadian Nickel. He's talking about his deposits. There's quite a few deposits elsewhere. The big problem actually outside of Indonesia is smelters. Finding mines is actually a lot easier than getting the billion or two it's going to take to put in a compliant smelter. And particularly if you start to look at, we always say, lock yourself in with an OEM, because the OEM is going to tell you what product they need in the future, not what product they need today. Okay. So if I put in a mine today and I'm looking to make MHP, that's great, because they want MHP to make their nickel sulfate. But look at what Tesla's saying, look at what Volkswagen's saying. They want a nickel powder because they don't want to have all the acids in the vehicle. They actually want to do a broad dry processing. And the world production of nickel powder today is minuscule. It's like 30,000-40,000 metric tons. if all of a sudden you need 500,000 tons of powder, where's it going to come from? Who's going to make it? How is it going to be made? And where will it be refined? These are the questions that, need to be answered. And, we're really curious from our perspective, when you see the European Union saying they're putting billions into the EV value stream, if you see the Biden administration saying they're putting billions into it, is it going to go to refining to really help out these miners? Because otherwise there's only a few smelters in the West.
Right. Yeah, and even our sister company, Mining Intelligence, did a study a while ago on of feasibility nickel projects with feasibility studies done in the last 5 years, and I think the proven and probable reserves on those projects were something like 2.7 million tons contained nickel. I mean, that there just seems to be a huge gap here, and I'm not sure how it's going to be filled if you're not going to deep sea tailings or an HPAL, which seems to be a very tricky thing to do.
It's going to be very interesting what happens. So I mean, again, if you're the OEM, you're looking at a basket of different technologies. You hope that the nickel industry invests in its industry, because nickel's great on the periodic table for making a battery work, but they're nervous. And so that's why you saw Tesla and Volkswagen both talk about high manganese batteries. Manganese market's about 10 times larger than the nickel market. It's pretty broadly diverse around the world from a geographic standpoint. LMO batteries are making a big comeback. LMO was sort of a battery that sort of went out like LFP, but LFP has come back, and now people are looking in lithium manganese batteries. So the car companies hope that the nickel market comes back. They privately wouldn't mind it if the nickel prices went into the low and mid 20s, because that's the number mining executives often say they need to see to believe that this is real, and they'll make investments. They don't want to see in the 30s or 40s, but in the low 20s sort of would make some sense for them. And at that point, they hope that we really start ramping up, looking for new mines, investing in new mines, and really try to provide the product that this industry is going to need. Otherwise, you could see sort of what happened with cobalt, with the price sparks, spiking to 100,000. Everyone is giddy and it's fantastic. And then it just collapsed on the other side of that as the chemists sort of say, well, we actually don't need cobalt, and we can find other alternatives. And, you reduce the cobalt usage by 90%, and the price comes back down to 20,000. So we don't want that to happen with nickel.
Yeah. Is there a chance we get a bifurcated market, that there is a supply chain going into China, mostly via Indonesia, maybe Philippines, and there is a sort of a ESG compliant nickel market, and for which you pay a premium that is kind of everywhere else?
It's very possible. I think from a number of different standpoints. One of the standpoints is regulations are not only used to clean up the environment, which obviously they help, but they're also to preserve jobs. And a lot of governments around the world are putting in regulations, not only, they really want localization of those assets. When you move from the production of an internal combustion engine to an EV, you are going to lose a lot of jobs. There just aren't many parts. You're going to see all car dealerships will pretty much go away. They make their money on fixing cars. There isn't really a lot to fix on an EV. And so governments realizing they're going to be losing, millions and millions of manufacturing jobs and jobs in fixing of vehicles. How can we keep as many jobs as possible? And localization rules sort of become important. And so, I don't think most governments would have a problem if Chinese companies want to invest in their local economy and create jobs and bring that material there. I think, sending those jobs to China just aren't very interesting for a lot of politicians in the West.
Right. Everybody seems to have a list of critical minerals these days, Europe, Canada, the US, but it really doesn't really always go much further than that. Do you see a time where there's real money going into supporting the industry? But like you said, building refineries might be, even a bigger task than building the mines. Is that what's going to be required? Because we have demand, the YZ Bay's expansion. just in Canada, there is potential, but it's a lot of money.
I mean, we actually have been working with a lot of governments around the world. There does seem to be a sincere interest to help this industry. They're trying to figure out the best way to do it. They're trying to find out the way to do it to, it's a tricky business for them. We know the old story. Everyone wants the jobs, but then we don't want the mines, and the NIMBYs come out. We've seen that recently with Portugal in terms of a lithium mine there. So they're trying to figure out what's the best way to move forward to try to do this. Portugal actually did do something that was interesting, where they're just going to convert an oil facility that was old and very cost competitive into a lithium refinery. So there are clever ways to try to get around, preserving jobs and moving to a new economy. And I think a lot of these governments are asking the right answers. I think they don't have a lot of knowledge here. So that's sort of part of our job here to educate. But I think there's a sincere interest to try to help, and there seems to be real money behind this as well. I do think that from the mining industry standpoint, when Elon Musk came out and was sort of talking, and I think it was the most hilarious slide ever, and he showed, this is the way the mining industry is today, is they take the rock and they do a bunch of stuff. It literally says they do a bunch of stuff to it, and then they move it and they do a lot more stuff to it. Our plan is to do a lot less stuff to it here and do even less stuff. And everyone sort of crucified Musk. He doesn't know anything about mining. And granted, it's the Musk way to look at the world. Yes. However, I think the mining industry does need to sort of have, often when we talk to miners, there's this, it can't be done any different. This is the way it's done. And I think that's incorrect. I think now is a really great time to come up with innovative solutions that could be more ESG friendly, that use less chemicals, that use less water, that uses new processing, that sort of takes a white sheet to the mine, and then work with the government and saying, hey, we really think we can do some really interesting things here. We'd like to plant this new technology. Could you help us with this or that? And I think governments are really eager, and OEMs are really eager, because they really want it to, they don't want to come out of this saying, we really haven't improved the world environment. We're doing stuff great. So there's a real interesting area now going on where new technologies can be brought to market, and I think miners can be sort of techies themselves, bringing new and innovative techniques to this market.
Speaking of novel ways of going about mining, we compiled a list of the 10 largest nickel projects around the world, and number one was Deep Green's nodules in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Now, already there's opposition and petitions, and I don't know what, Google telling us not what to mine and not to mine type scenarios. What do you think of deep sea mining? Is that something that's gonna happen? Does it have to happen if we're all driving in electric cars?
It's going to be interesting. Look, OEMs have become very powerful in the world, as much as governments, as to which nickel we're going to use or not use. It was Tesla last August that came out publicly and said they would not buy any nickel from a mine that did ocean tailings dumpings. And literally within 4 or 5 months, pretty much every nickel mine that was planning to do that, particularly in Indonesia, said they were going to do dry stacking. It was interesting because I was actually talking to a manager of a mine in Indonesia, and they were like, Ken, this is tough business. Yeah, we're not going to do it. It's going to increase our costs, tenfold in terms of dry stacking relative to just dumping the waste in the ocean. But we're in we're in an earthquake sensitive area. The only place to really put this dry stacking is into deep valleys. Those deep valleys have very diverse ecoclimates, and we're already seeing people protesting that. And so, how this all works out is going to be really interesting, because it's going to be interesting to see how it does this. So you're right. I have seen it. Was it the World Wildlife Fund has signed up a whole bunch of automakers to say they don't want to procure nickel coming from oceans. So, does this become very widespread and sort of nip it in the bud before it even starts, or not? Or do people realize, hey, we need to have these batteries, and therefore we have no alternative, and this is an open source of it. It's going to be very tricky to see. So I think automakers are sort of, a lot of them are sitting back. They're wondering, do we need the nickel? So that's what I'm saying, does manganese sort of replace nickel if it's going to become so problematic for them? What works, what doesn't work, and what can keep us sort of ahead of the curve? And that's sort of the big question right now.
Right. I think maybe we should go to questions. Let me just hear it there. I'll start with something from James Cornier Chisholm. Wasi Bay's hydrometallurgical process is uses 12 times less CO2 than Indonesia, whereas smelter processes dominate to oxidize the ore before the electrowinning step. Could you talk about the hydrometallurgical process at the Vale and how it applies to nickel?
Well, the way I would answer it, since I'm not a metallurgist, I won't want to go there, but I do want to say a very important part of that question is the CO2 reduction. And there's a lot of people who say, we get an awful lot of miners who sort of say, why should I make big investments to become ESG compliant when I go to my buyer, particularly the automaker, and they'll say, we prefer you over material, say, coming from Indonesia, but we won't pay you anymore. And so there's a huge, and so how does that going to work out? And I think our reply is, you will have to pay. There is very big movement in the world, particularly on CO2, to have a CO2 market, and you'll have to pay a tax on CO2. What we have done quite a bit is we are setting up a lot of CO2 curves. So not only do we have cost curves here at McKinsey, we have CO2 curves here at McKinsey. And we're actually doing, for a number of clients, every single step along the way, where is the CO2 generated? If you are Tsingshan, you are going to go to a renewable resource, because currently, you're going to do their process using coal-fired power plants. How much, by taking out the coal-fired power plants somewhat, is that impact? And so I think that's the big question, is what is the premium you will get for your product over time because of your low, say, CO2 footprint? And that's, is it $50 a ton? Is it $200 a ton carbon tax? And then how does that sort of work back? Because the best mines in the world can be something on the 6 to 10 metric tons per ton of nickel produced. The worst can be several hundred tons of CO2 per metric ton. And so it could be a huge difference in premiums and discounts. Right.
Maybe just take a fresh view of the market, stepping back from nickel, and just, if we're talking about lithium ion, and as if that is the only thing out there. What about hydrogen and fuel cell vehicles? Should we be talking about that right now, or is that something further out?
We think it's further out. I come from this personally as a very jaundiced, I used to be a portfolio manager, and quite honestly, in the early 2000s, I made a lot of money shorting every fuel cell company out there. The technology just wasn't there yet. I think the technology is a lot closer to coming there. The problem, or the issue that needs to be overcome for fuel cells, is the hydrogen costs. So the numbers I have seen is a Tesla supercharger cost, I think, about $75,000 to install a 220 kilowatt Tesla supercharger. Hydrogen stations can run $2, $3, $4 million. And how do I outfit, a country or a large area with that much, it just doesn't make any sense. So you did see, actually, California was going to put in a bunch of hydrogen fueling stations. They stopped that. They sort of ran out of money. Germany's made some efforts. So I think you have two things to worry about on the fuel cell front. One, does the fuel cell technology work? Not 300-kilometer cars, but can I get a 600 or 800 or 900-kilometer range truck? And then also, can I fuel it efficiently? And who's going to foot the bill for that infrastructure? And we do think it's going to happen. We do see costs coming down pretty dramatically for hydrogen, but we think it's more like a 2040 type of time frame, not a 2030 type of time frame.
So if you do want to ride the 2040 hydrogen wave, I guess you have to start getting your platinum mine going.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting. I mean, Ballard is probably a great Canadian company to at least track and see what they're doing in this space. And I think they put out a lot of really good research. I don't really look at it myself too closely, but I do remember, Ballard's, one of the biggest in the world at looking at this, and probably if I'm an investor, at least just to look at some of the presentations and see what's going on.
Right. So one last thing, this is also more general, the pricing environment within the broader battery metals. There are quite a few price providers. You can get different prices at different frequencies. Where does McKinsey go to get the insights of what's going on? Do you have your own people scouring the earth?
We don't do. We're not a pricing service. We do have a mine asset service, but we don't have a pricing service. We often are asked for procurement purposes. How do I price this material? Generally, what that happens with that is you really want to get the buyer and the seller together and sort of say which price most closest represents the product that you're providing. And because at the end of the day, what you're going to probably do is have a long-term contract that's based upon that index, probably a quarterly reset. Most people in the OEMs, they really care about the delivery of the material, that they have access to that material, that they're not shut out like they're shut out of chips today. So they really care about the quality and the consistency of the delivery of that material. The pricing will then come down to, whatever index, and everyone has different ways to look at these indices. But you'll run correlations, which one gave you the highest price over time, which gave you the lowest price over time. I mean, these people are pretty smart in doing that, and they'll come together. At the end of the day, it usually comes into pretty close to the same price, no matter what index they use. But it all depends on how you want to price it and which one you think is more important. I do see a question on there about air batteries. We often get a question about air batteries. Not a big believer in air batteries today. Maybe it comes through in the future. Remember, an air battery isn't really an air battery. It's an oxygen battery. So air batteries, you're actually feeding 100% pure oxygen to try to get a reaction to make the battery work. Had some really interesting, I was speaking to a number of university professors who had spent years and built teams to look at this. They were not terribly excited about it anytime soon. So could it happen? Yes. You never know when someone's going to wake up with that eureka moment and all of a sudden make something work. But it isn't something that we would at least see in the short to medium term. Watch the companies and where they're making their investments. Most of the companies are making their investments in lithium-ion batteries. Most of the companies are making investments in sort of nickel-rich cathodes, with new investments being made, and as we talked about, manganese alternatives or additives to that nickel. But nickel sits really good on the periodic table, so it's just it takes and gives up electrons quickly, and at the end of the day, for a vehicle, that's exactly what you want. All other materials have sort of drawbacks that need to be overcome and doped and things of that nature, and they could, but nickel sort of has the pole position right now. We just hope that the industry responds with enough material that that it's continued to be used long into the future.
Right. I was actually looking at the chat and not the Q&A, so I see another question that I want to put to you. How about low-grade sulfide deposits, less than 1%, say? Are we there yet?
I mean, I think there's some interesting technologies out there to process this material, and so I do think there's people are always trying to innovate. People are always trying to find new ways to process this material. So I do think that it could be at scale. It could be using different ways to process the material with selective acids and things of that nature that could make these type of assets more amenable. A lot of it depends on, again, what are the other elements in there. Again, if I'm trying to meet a part per billion type of measurement, there's certain elements that if they're in the ore body, just make it very, very difficult to process that down the line. Too expensive to just precipitate out that pure nickel at a reasonable cost. And so that's something that you sort of have to take every asset it is. What is interesting, I love our guys at Mindspans, who what we do here at McKinsey is we built every single mine in the world bottoms up, rather than most people look top down, we bottom up. And so we have a flow sheet. So we basically create, this mine has this flow sheet, and here's all the costs that have to go into it, energy, additives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. For gold, I think we have about 50 flow sheets. For copper, I think we have like 25 flow sheets. For nickel, every mine in the world has a different flow sheet. Every single one has a different flow sheet. And so that's what makes nickel, such a difficult metal to mine and to understand and to really produce. And so that's sort of the challenge as an industry we face.
Right. I think we might have chance for one more, Laura, one more question. Maybe
yes, of course, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, great. If you're an outside investor and you want to be part of the electric vehicle narrative, are you going to be investing in a lithium operation, a nickel operation, maybe cobalt, or is copper the way to go? Just because the story is so big around copper.
Well, remember, first off, I'll dispel one notion. Since we tear down EVs all the time, there's a lot less copper in an EV than people think. The number you see in the internet is 4 times. It's more like 1.3. It's like 1.3.
Oh.
There is copper in the charging stations, and so we think that gives it a growth kicker. But calling copper the green is a bit of a sales job. Okay. What's interesting is who makes the money. It's not the cell makers. Cell makers have historically all lost money. So, we always tell, it's the biggest part of the market. When you look at Panasonic, LG, SK, and you look at their financial statements, they have consistently lost money. And the cell maker, the reason is the technology moves so fast. They have about a 30% yield loss every time they change to a new technology. And that has happened about every year. So when it takes you 12 to 18 months to ramp up, it's just as they're starting to see some leeway on that, then they fall. The one caveat is LFP batteries that CATL has been making for more than a decade. CATL is a profitable company making those batteries. And when it comes down to, I wouldn't pick a particular metal, but I would always, when I talk to the management, ask them, are you planning to be a merchant provider, just a commodity provider of your lithium, cobalt, or nickel, or are you going to be integrated in downstream with your customers? If they give you the first answer, we've already saw the answer in the lithium market. Those who are merchant providers to the lithium market, had the most severe losses. Those who had integrated themselves in the value chain saw much more steady margins and came out of the bottom of the cycle much stronger. So, that is the one crucial goal. And so I always tell mining companies, I know you're really into your geologist and your processing team, but you need to invest heavily in your commercial team, because if they don't get you those long-term contracts to integrate yourself, you're not going to know what product they're going to be asking for you in the future. Someone else will, and they'll get that profit pool over you. And so therefore you'll lose out at the end of the day. And so that's a really important aspect to ask these management teams.
Right. Laura, I lost a bit of track of time. Can we continue? There's so much.
You know what? Actually, you're so right. We have huge engagement from the audience here. How about we do one more question, and then Ken will make sure that we send you the remaining questions that we can't get to live.
Right.
Sure.
I think it's FPX nickel and, am I saying this right? AU right. What can you say about that? What is happening there?
I absolutely have no clue.
Okay.
I'll be honest with you. That's just one thing I'm sorry. I don't have a big answer about that. Okay. So no, the interesting thing though, at the end of the day, is we do get a lot of questions about which batteries will win, which batteries will lose. Always look at, what is the cost those batteries are going to come in? What application do they serve? Okay. So for example, stationary storage is far, far different than vehicles. So you've seen, flow batteries really become very, very interesting there. So, always remember what's the niche market or the main market your commodity is going to, or your battery is going to, then look for who's making investments. So for example, we used to talk to some vanadium producers a few years ago, and they would say, what are our prospects? And we're like, we don't see any big, anyone big making investments. And then all of a sudden you start to see Saudi Arabia and German companies really start to make heavy investments. That changes things. If you're going to pay the researchers to really investigate your metal and how it can be used in a battery solution, that sort of changes. So follow the money from the industry to see which metals might be successful.
Right. And I mean, obviously Musk is, he built that in 100 days, that energy storage thing in Australia. But yes, vanadium redox is probably the better way for stationary. I mean, you don't need
Well, again, it all depends on your application. If you want just a 1 hour or a 4 hour application, which is very sort of short and sweet, lithium batteries are very, very good for that. Other batteries are good for what we call long duration. So you may need it overnight, or you may need to do it for a week or something of that nature. And so there are many, many different applications, and you will not, you'll see many, many battery applications. It's not oil. There's just oil. There's going to be a whole slew of applications. Each one will have their own niche. Each one will be dependent on the size of that niche. So for example, could we use vanadium for whatever reason in the vehicle? No, because you're not going to make 100 million vehicles in a vanadium market that's very, very small. But could you find some really interesting vanadium applications for stationary? It's possible. It's very, very possible, because you don't, you won't tax the market that strongly.
Right. Thank you very much. It's such a huge industry and a growing industry. We should definitely talk about this more.
Always happy to. It's my favorite subject. I'm quite passionate about.
Great.
Well, you can certainly see that passion coming through, Ken. Thank you so much. Thank you, Frik. Fantastic conversation. It's obviously such a critical topic, and people are being inundated with information. So for Ken, for you to come on and really kind of set the record straight and what people should be looking for, high value. Thank you, gentlemen.
Anytime. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
Cheers.
Thank you.